Welcome to Narrative Machines, a theory podcast that explores memetics, myth, and propaganda. How our narratives define the limits of our political and personal identity, how they can be controlled, how this era may be consigned to myth just as it was defined by it. Previous drafts of these ideas were published in 2017 in Narrative Machines, Mythos Media, in 2020 in Masks, Bowie and Artists of Artifice, Intellect, University of Chicago, and in various now-defunct web publications. It is presented here in audio format for the first time with additional reflections and editorial. For more of the author's work in various mediums and formats, visit jamescurcio.com. You can also find more podcasts and articles about RPGs and collective storytelling at modernmythology.net. Episode 1. Foundations. The past is the future.
Human beings live in their myths. They only endure their realities. Robert Anton Wilson.
We live in an age which most of all resents itself, ever awakening to a present that is at odds with our most cherished wishes and hopes, a future which never arrives until it is too late. It is always in the process of arriving, of accelerating. We feel alternately, paradoxically, that we must be saved from progress or from tradition. "Save us from the future," cries one protester, while the other shouts just as loudly, "Save us from the past." Maybe it has always been so, and maybe not. Who writes the greatest fictions and who pen the greatest truths? Even superheroes have to be placed within the hyperreal to become believable again. We can only take irony seriously and must heap scorn on the serious and risk the heresy of laughter always at someone's expense. At this moment, many of our myths look backwards and forwards at the same time, towards a retro future. Perhaps we subconsciously spot a bottleneck on the road ahead, and so can only really imagine the past, even while we are committed by the myth of progress to imagine that the line can only ever go up. The only questions we can ask are aesthetic. Which parts of the past do we include in this Frankenstein's monster, and which do we omit? Which fits the personal brand of ourselves, of our imaginary, glorified movements? We have never been quite so alone in terms of the fragmenting and atomization of communities, and yet never have we been so surrounded by a diversity of myths in which we can dream ourselves and our world. So it is that the coming retro future is an invention of editors and artists, of a kind. Worst of all, it would seem dictators wield a certain type of creative license in their role as editor. We need our myths to situate us, to frame the boundaries and horizons. The spectacle distracts us from ourselves, and that is the only apparent value of art in the age of propaganda. It has often been to the artists to help us see the contours of that narrative, to help us see ourselves. This link of mirror and myth makes the social role of the artist finally clear. Who has the attention for challenging art anymore? And what artists have the budget or reach? Advertisers and influencers increasingly hold sway with predictable results. Meanwhile, it is becoming the scientists and anthropologists that preach the end, should we continue upon the course on which we find ourselves. Whatever the future holds, the end of history as a static utopia has been revoked. Or perhaps it has been revealed for what it truly is, an eschatology. But it is also likely that Fukuyama has been consistently misread. The end of history is either a gravestone or a high point from which we must recede. The peak often swiftly becomes the nadir. Every major geopolitical event of this decade seems to point in this direction. The present is, in some sense, always an end of history, a point of departure where a future without end along the lines of thought of our present conditions seems possible. The spirit of the age is seen precisely in this anxious clawing forward and backward at the same time. At this very moment, we too are subject to this new force of mythic history and culture, and are under their sway as if they flowed from reality itself, Hegel's zeitgeist, but we can't see it from the inside. Our uncertainty about the spirit of our age raises a significant problem. Are we still living in the shadow of World War? Are we still trudging through a psycho-historical framework that was shaped by the mutual annihilation of modernity in the fires in Dresden, the death camps, or the leveling of Hiroshima? Is the future a cul-de-sac? How did it get to be 4 a.m., and where is our pants? Our dreams of revolution and apocalypse, too, are weapons that have been used against us. We would all like to start again, an opportunity for a cosmic do-over. We can only begin here, wherever here happens to be, using the materials that are available to us, provided by our misremembered past and whomever's graves we can plunder. Psychology is always rooted in history, but what it reacts to is rarely clear to the conscious mind except in retrospect. Whatever I say is good is good. The popular is always great by this standard. Metrics of this sort have allowed corporate interests to turn the world into reality TV, an ongoing performance that we must undergo to demonstrate that we are good, valuable enough to have the privilege of human rights. The problem is always in the fact that everything is remade in our minds, but it isn't remade from scratch. We will come to see how little we have managed to escape the clutches of the past. Its story calls to us still. Yet this is ever as it was. No ontological sea change has actually occurred beyond an accelerative cultural leap of the sort that followed the printing press. Baudrillard recognized that everywhere socialization is measured by the exposure to media messages. Whoever is unexposed to the media is desocialized or virtually asocial. The question then is what follows. In his estimation, a collapse. Where we think that information produces meaning, the opposite occurs. Whatever these lines of thought are, they aren't a Frankfurt School-style tirade about consumption. There is no use in a class battle over which symbols and forms of media are high and which low, which messages are vulgar and which are refined. In this sense, we're engaging in a sort of theoretic burlesque. This is for people who are engaged in understanding and creating culture, but hopefully it isn't purely for academics.
Reality is material for artistic construction. Since the world itself is regarded as material, the demand underlying the modern conception of art for power over the materials implicitly contains the demand for power over the world. This power doesn't recognize any limitations and cannot be challenged by any other non-artistic authority, since humanity and all human thought, science, traditions, institutions, and so on are declared to be subconsciously, or to put it differently, materially, determined and therefore subject to restructuring according to a unitary artistic plan. Groys.
The explicit purpose of theory is not necessarily to act, though theory is always a covert action in another sense. Our words are without fixed, absolute meaning, but they always do something. Poetry, it might be said, is the art of misunderstanding. Nothing in this podcast will seem by any traditional measure poetic, but its aims remain more poetic than scientific, more mythos than logos, merely performed at another level of remove. It is our pretension that we might get out the filleting knife and lay bare the mechanisms through which we understand ourselves. But directions of thought can be suggested. Pretense is certainly required, although none of it is pretend. The assemblage that is to follow also presents a certain departure from what is now a sort of orthodoxy in cultural theory, while at the same time following in its footsteps. At best, this is a launching pad, breadcrumbs for artists and theorists who recognize that both art and theory are acts within the world. At worst, it is degenerate philosophy, proudly made by degenerates, for degenerates. It always depends who you ask. Only this much is certain. We are narrative machines. We combine, reconfigure, and regurgitate material that is never in an essential sense our own, or all we are. We are never one. We are many disparate bodies, never fully unified, except for through our myths. The only question is whether we embrace or resist our isolation and dance with our masks on or hide in the darkness. As Antonin Artaud wrote in The Theatre and Its Double, all writing is filth. The tyranny of the literal.
It is only through active, ceaseless interpretation that we might catch a reflected glimpse of the human subject at the heart of literature. It is only by acknowledging artifice that one can move beyond artifice. Reading is a creative act. Unlike almost everything we are encouraged to consider entertainment, it is an active pursuit. Without this process of interpretation, we cannot know ourselves. The Tyranny of the Literal, Australian Book Review.
Myths speak to our need of stories and images, both grand and mundane, for us to relate ourselves to. However, they're often introduced as a childish thing that must at some point be put aside. As a youth, who can remember staring at the television in befuddlement as documentaries would attempt to discover the supposed historic truth of a myth? Did giants actually walk the earth before the time of King Arthur's court? How did Noah manage to get every species of animal aboard a single ship? Of course, the world wasn't literally made in 7 days. Of course, Odin wasn't literally suspended from a tree. This misunderstanding bites both ways, as literalism often dominates our religious and secular, even literary thinking. They are the wrong questions to ask, and for the wrong reasons. In the public mind, myth has become the opposite of fact, something that is generally accepted but untrue. So we might say, it is a myth that reading by flashlight ruins your eyesight. The popular Discovery Channel show Mythbusters uses this definition, attempting to disprove myths with something vaguely resembling science. The myths of antiquity are looked upon as quaint stories, despite the fact that they shaped history, how it is interpreted, even how it happened. This secular Occidental conception, which is the root of modern myth, says the myths of the past were erroneous explanations about the nature of reality. Fanciful stories, which, though colourful and interesting curiosities, surely bear no particular use to our lives. In this, we misunderstand how myths function. Many myths do not principally intend to explain the world in an analytic sense, and so it is not a failure if they fail to do so. And even if they once did intend to serve as an instrument of science, we can put that intention aside and find that myth is a reflection on us more than it is a reflection on the world without us in it. To anyone who winces at the thought of a story being just another form of a lie, the relegation of myth to the status of untruth should appear unfortunate. However, this tacitly defines a predominant conception of our times. It serves as the dividing line between the archaic past and the modern. Even amongst the ranks of those who are generally most sympathetic to the psychological value of myth, there has been an increasing question of if myth has any place in our lives. Spiritual metaphors are useful in as much as they describe mental states, but the considerations of model-dependent realism should be applied here as it applies to the applicability of interpretation within the context of necessity and uncertainty. This view, presented by Dawkins and Molodino in their 2010 book, The Grand Design, states that the models are to be judged by their confluence with observations, but that can't be retroactively used to demonstrate the absolute reality of the model outside the context of its use. We can certainly apply the same perspective to our understanding of narrative machines.
Like the overlapping maps in a Mercator projection, where the ranges of different versions overlap, they predict the same phenomena. But just as there is no flat map that is a good representation of the Earth's entire surface, there is no single theory that is a good representation of observations in all situations. The Grand Design, Hawking, and Molodino.
Keep this concept in mind as we proceed into subsequent episodes beyond this introduction. There is no single theory that is a good representation of observations in all situations. Defining the undefinable. The absolutely central role of myth in our lives shouldn't need explanation or qualification. And yet it does, now more than ever. It will quickly become apparent why this is so. At the outset, it's not even entirely clear what we mean by myth, unless we merely play with semantics. Aren't some stories myths while others are not? Maybe. However, the stories we tell ourselves and one another can always later become myths in one form or another. All we can say for certain at the get-go is that myths collectivize our sense of self, of character, of meaning, of context. It's not good enough that you know a story. What's important is that we both do and can orient ourselves in relationship to our interpretations of it. Literary interpretation has been responsible for countless deaths after all, if we include schisms over the interpretation of religious texts, or of legal ones. There is ultimately no static and final interpretation of any text, and the authority to hierarchize or prioritize an interpretation is the centralizing principle of tradition and a fundamental form of social power. Outside the arcane framework of semioticians like Roland Barthes, who approaches the subject in his book Mythologies as one might prepare specimens in a museum, it is also surprisingly hard to make a clean distinction between story, narrative, and myth. Maybe stories are simply myths that have not gained mythic resonance. That's a frequently employed, but entirely vague way to say they are stories which haven't yet sprouted from the seed of some collective belief. Fundamentally, myths, stories and narratives, accounts, interpretations are all made of the same stuff. Stories we tell ourselves, stories we tell one another, stories we tell about what those stories mean, on and on. We can hardly know ourselves without a myth to serve as our mirror. Myths convey meaning, or rather, are a meaning that we participate in creating. Mythos means by mouth. It is that which is spread, a fabric woven of memes. A story implies a series of events. A narrative feels somehow at once less and more grandiose, and might encompass either. These distinctions break down further in the hands of narrative theorists and semioticians by level of mediation. So stories, once they've become culturally embedded or repeated, are generalized into myths, and those myths serve as a kind of connective tissue for human societies. There may be some sense in considering myth a story that has been repeated and solidified with that collective repetition and remembrance, which at one and the same time permutes with each retelling in each mind. We place ourselves within a world as defined by them. We may recognize this world as fiction or not, and it may or may not correspond to the facts. Furthermore, we may very well know the myth doesn't correspond with facts, or we may not, and its function remains unchanged. Maybe this changeability is how myth came to mean simply false. Collective fictions give us a sense of meaning and purpose. The condition we must accept is that we must pretend the stories we inherit or invent, the image on the screen, or the entities in our dreams represent some type of reality. That conveyed meaning is what need they fulfill, but not what use they serve within human society, what they do. The function of myths, a paper napkin sketch. Myths inform the relationships between things. In religion, this is the Latin religio, or religiare, although of course theology is just one type of mythic codex. Myths define who we are, define where we are in time, what role we serve, and what the nature of that role should be. They do not even need to be believed to serve these functions, as is often the case in granting social power to leaders without recognizing their divine mandate and so on. The hypothetical what if that informs many myths are the same type of fantasies and are informed by the same impulses as the rest of the psyche. These ideas which are drawn from and bleed back into the material world, the myths of nations, of gods and kings, have had a direct effect on human history. As the genetic and ecological future is shaped by such phantasms, whether an institution erected after the fact or as inspirational motive, identity is grounded in myth. All our relationships with ourselves and with one another are composed of the stories we agree upon, or are made to agree upon. Another form of the social contract. Myths are a selector for social motility. We are tugged and pulled by them, as they are simultaneously created by us and creating us, existing at all the junctures where our worlds overlap with one another. Myths arise as relationships, points of intersection. They present within a context, and it is in that context in which they must be understood. All these relations are complex and involve various open ambiguities. For example, the relationship between ritual object or work of art and an individual audience member, the relationship of creator with that object, or between audience members themselves, all occur within the conceptual framework provided by our implied and largely subconscious assumptions about those things, especially the almost inaudible but ever-present whispers of the past. Many of our most potent myths are not even known or remembered. Finally, myths are strange attractors, the underlying structure or set of values toward which a system tends to evolve. Myths are strange attractors. Renowned scientist and professional crank Richard Dawkins defined meme as a self-reproducing and propagating information structure analogous to a gene in biology. Various theorists have adapted the concept of memes to other domains, mythemes, neuremes, and so on. In light of amplified reproducibility online, a more fertile culture for them to grow in, this subject has also expanded from social and pop science to political and even military import. A tutorial on military memetics, presented at the 2011 Social Media for Defense Summit, defines a meme as information which propagates, has impact, and persists, going on to elaborate that it could include words, ideas, symbols, icons, logos, tunes, poems, catchphrases, fashion, technological processes, e.g. making arrowheads or gumbo, fables, religion, graffiti, images, novels, movies, narratives, culture, functional or dysfunctional, national, tribal, or organizational. The Defense Advanced Projects Research Agency, DARPA, has not been alone in supporting a series of memetics-related projects with multidisciplinary teams from industry, the military, and academia. The integration of these approaches with algorithms, social media, and AI presents one of the fundamental battle spaces of the present and future. By virtue of this, analysis of myth is inherently a discussion of memetics, though the inverse may not always be the case. As much as we may want to reduce memes to silly photos shared on Facebook, these are just the tip of a very large iceberg. And as this narrative research is better wedded to information and systems theory analysis, we can be sure there will be more to come. A meme suffices, at the very least, as a metaphor for any idea that has the potential to be turned into a social act. As with most metaphors, there are ways in which it is accurate and ways that it is not. More importantly, what are the repercussions of this idea of the overlapping relationship of genes and culture? In other words, do myths play a role in our evolution as a part of our mirrored relationships with one another?
Darwin's basic insight was that animal and plant species are the cumulative result of a process of descent and modification. Later on, however, scientists came to realize that any variable replicator, not just genetic replicators, coupled to any sorting device, not just ecological selection pressures, would generate a capacity for evolution. Delander, 1,000 years of nonlinear history.
The best in terms of survival depends in large measure on the conditions of the environment and all the possibilities that can be defined within that space. Sorting is taking place when we are attracted to one book and not another, or one song and not another. Although it is a prosaic example, think about the sorting and matching occurring when we recognize we've both seen the same movie, how we compare mutual reactions to the story, and how it might affect far more than mere entertainment. Shared reference are social currency. This is not, at the same time, a top-down sort of brainwashing, nor is it entirely fixed and embedded in indelible biology. It is instead the fluid pre-existing conditions that structure social life. Power structures are navigated and codified through externalizations of value, often implicitly, and often in a sense which has no direct connection to sexual reproduction or intercourse. Artists are inherently mythically promiscuous. Nevertheless, the ideas that are most compelling to us, the art that attracts and changes us, seems to operate on the same principles that determine a mating selection process. As will be discussed in much greater depth in later episodes, this is part of the central role aesthetics plays in our lives. In politics, in identity, in religion, in economies, and so on. Selection processes, sorting mechanisms, and other systemic relationships apply to the ways myths replicate, spread, feed, and die. Concurrently, these play a fundamental role in shaping social dynamics. They are a part of these feedback mechanisms.
Richard Dawkins independently realized that patterns of animal behavior, such as bird songs or the use of tools by apes, could indeed replicate themselves if they spread across a population and across generations by imitation. Delander, 1,000 years of non-linear history.
This has clear repercussions in the study of the diffusion of language and culture. No matter how many layers of regress are added here, it is the relationship formed by a myth that gives it a defining motive. Here we see the undercurrent of all forms of human representation, a collective shadow that looms over societies, which we've taken to refer to simply as myth. In Ed Yong's book, I Contain Multitudes, the ecological structure of both microbiomes and ecosystems are established, and it is further observed that they behave according to similar self-determined rules. That is, the context of an ecosystem is dependent on every other component element of that system, and vice versa, and the same is true of the microbiome of our body and the billions of organisms that live within us, or we might more accurately say, which are a part of us. We are always a we, never a me. The same point holds for myths. An analogy can be drawn between the relationship of the two, microbiomes and mythologies, in a manner of scale, emulating the Gnostic motto, as above, so below. The observations drawn in the world of biogeography might be applied to the behavior of narrative as a part of an ecosystem. As the internet further acts as a representation of social networks, analysis can be assisted through elaborate real-time modeling of the global narrative machine. That should be as terrifying as it is fascinating.
A body plan defines a space of possibilities, the space of all possible vertebrate designs, for example. The formal study of these possibility spaces is more advanced in physics and chemistry, where they are referred to as phase spaces. Their structure is given by topological invariants called attractors, as well as by the dimensions of the space, dimensions that represent the degrees of freedom or relevant ways of changing of concrete physical or chemical dynamical systems. In the biological and social sciences, on the other hand, we do not yet have the appropriate formal tools to investigate the structure of their much more complex possibility spaces. A New Philosophy of Society, Delander.
Theorizing with a light touch. Tools of literary, psychological, and social analysis may be applied here, but lightly. Additionally, neurological and mathematical linguistic models, such as LLMs, will undoubtedly continue to play a role, integrating diverse, interdisciplinary perspectives. Our approach on this podcast will be mostly in the direction of the humanities. However, other avenues also present themselves. As we will explore on the Modern Mythology podcast, on modernmythology.net, introducing elements of game and the uncertainty of collaborative real-time interactions is an equally valid source, both for generating new collective stories and as a sample social dynamic. What we uncover in this domain may never achieve absolute certainty within an academic framework. Numerous challenges arise when attempting a comprehensive systems theory approach to myth, but pursuing such an endeavor would be worthwhile. Not only in the hope of understanding ourselves and our narratives better, but more troublingly, because these semantic and sentiment systems are already at work in our social technological ecosystems, our media, our political systems, our markets, all as a part of the ever-evolving web of language, darting around the globe and bouncing off our satellites. This opens up the door for new approaches to mythic study, which go far beyond what can be explored here, but we are hopeful that more work will continue in this direction in the future. You have been listening to Narrative Machines. More work from the author can be found at jamescurcio.com and modernmythology.net. To support the production of works such as this, visit patreon.com/mythosmedia.